Hey everyone, Ryan Eckert here with Peak Endurance Solutions. Today we're going to be talking about functional threshold power. So this is a pretty common term amongst cyclists and triathletes. I'm sure if you are a cyclist or a triathlete, at some point you've heard someone spout off what their FTP is, right? And so FTP stands for functional threshold power. And your functional threshold power is essentially a measurement of your 60-minute lactate threshold or your 60-minute anaerobic threshold. And so what does that mean? That means the maximal effort, pace, or power that you could sustain for 60 minutes. That's your lactate threshold or your anaerobic threshold. And one of the ways that we can measure that as a cyclist or as a triathlete is through testing. And so obviously it's pretty difficult to go out there, and it's very taxing both mentally and physically to go out there and just ride as hard as you can for 60 minutes. Nobody wants to go do that. And it might not be one of the best ways to do it anyways, just because it's so difficult to do on your own in non-racing circumstances. And so one of the ways that we can estimate your 60-minute threshold is by testing. And there are a variety of different tests out there that have been developed for people to determine their 60-minute threshold. One of the more common ones is this 20-minute FTP test that was developed by Hunter Allen and Allen Coggan quite a number of years back. And essentially what this test does is after a long warm-up, so there's a pretty substantial warm-up portion to it. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about the importance of this warm-up later on. But at the end of that warm-up, there's this 20-minute time trial. And so this 20-minute time trial is what really matters. So from this 20-minute time trial, you're going to be hopefully gathering power. So this test is really best for those who have a power meter. You can use heart rate and you can use pace, like speed in terms of miles per hour, if you're on a pancake flat surface where there's no hills and there's no turns and there's no stops and there's no lights. But this test is best done for those who have a power meter, because what you really want is that 20-minute average power. And then you take that 20-minute average power and you multiply it by 95%, and that, in theory, estimates your 60-minute functional threshold power. And so when it comes to testing, one of the first questions you have to ask yourself is this test actually measuring what it's intending to measure? And so in this case, we're trying to measure your 60-minute threshold. And let's actually take one quick step back and let's talk about what threshold is. So for those of you who are maybe less well versed on the physiology of what your anaerobic or lactate threshold is, like I said, it's the maximal effort, pace, power that you can sustain for 60 minutes. And so why does this matter for endurance athletes? Well, this is one of a few other markers of fitness that have been shown to be very well correlated with performance. So as threshold goes up, your performance goes up. And this is across a range of endurance distances. So whether you're a cyclist, whether you're a runner, I know we're talking about cycling specific threshold here, but this same concept applies to all endurance athletes, whether it's runners, cyclists, swimmers, triathletes. But as your threshold goes up, your speed in races is more than likely going to go up as well. And the reason for this is that exercise intensities that are just below threshold, so let's say you're working at 95% of your threshold, in theory, you can maintain that pace for a lot longer than 60 minutes. Whereas if you go just a notch above threshold, say to 105% of threshold, so you're now just 5% above your threshold, in theory, you can maintain that pace for a lot shorter than 60 minutes. And for those of you who have actually done an FTP test and who have determined your 60-minute threshold, and who have actually done a workout where you ride at, say, 95% of threshold and 105% of threshold, there's a pretty big difference in how 95% of threshold feels and how 105% of threshold feels. And that's because this 60-minute threshold is like the tipping point of fatigue. So staying underneath your threshold, you're going to accumulate a lot less fatigue, a lot slower. And so the fatigue is essentially due to a buildup of too much lactate in the system. And I won't go into the physiology of why lactate causes fatigue necessarily in this video, But as an endurance athlete, for most of the racing that we're doing, it's longer than an hour. Even for triathletes who are doing a sprint distance race, that's for the most part below your threshold, because most of us are taking an hour or longer to complete it. And by definition, you should be below your threshold for the most part during that race because it's longer than an hour. And so this threshold, though, that's the tipping point of fatigue, right? As I was saying. And so as an endurance athlete, you're trying to avoid the buildup of too much lactate in the blood, because with the rapid accumulation of lactate, when you go above your lactate threshold, that brings with it pretty quick fatigue. And so most of our racing, therefore, is done below threshold. And so with training, one of the many goals that an athlete should have in training would be to, over time, hopefully see improvements in your threshold. So if your threshold is 200 watts, 2 or 3 years from now, hopefully your threshold is 220 watts or 230 watts. Because the higher your threshold, the higher power outputs you can sustain below your threshold without being fatigued. So if you were getting fatigued before holding 180 watts because your threshold was 200 watts, well, now if you get your threshold up to 250 watts, 180 watts is probably going to feel a whole lot easier because you now have a higher threshold and you can tolerate higher power outputs without accumulating quite as much fatigue. And so threshold matters in terms of testing because, one, you want to test where your threshold is at, so you get an idea of what your 60-minute threshold is. But then also by doing tests to determine where your threshold is, you can also determine training zones from that. And obviously you want to have accurate training zones as well as an accurate 60-minute threshold. And so that's where testing comes into play. Since most of us aren't doing a 60-minute all-out time trial to determine our threshold, we do tests to estimate it. And so, like I said back in the beginning, one of the first questions I ask myself as a coach and as an athlete is, well, how accurate is this test at actually telling me what my threshold is? And that's your validity. And then the second question you have to ask yourself is, how good is this test at being repeatable or reliable, right? So reliability is another big piece of this testing situation. And so basically what that means is, if I do this test over and over and over again under the exact same circumstances, is it going to give me the same measurement, right? So if I were to do this test today and then do it again next week and then do it again the week after that, this is assuming that I'm not training to improve my threshold. Am I going to get the exact same measurement every single time I do it? If I'm getting radically different measurements, well, then it's not very reliable. And if I'm also getting measurements that are, say, 200 watts, but my true threshold is actually 300 watts, well, then that's also not a very valid test. And so we want to try and pick tests that are both valid and reliable so that we get an accurate and reliable measurement of our threshold. And then therefore we can determine accurate training zones. And so why am I talking about all this? Well, this is a pretty common test that most people use. And I came across a pretty recently published research article that actually aimed to determine the validity of this test. And I thought it was pretty interesting because I had never come across a research article that had aimed to determine the validity of this test. I'm not sure what's been published years and years and years ago, but this one was published in 2019 actually. And it was a group of researchers who looked to see if that 20-minute threshold test that was developed by Hunter Allen and Andrew Coggan was valid in terms of, does it actually measure what your true lactate threshold is? And so essentially what the researchers did in this study was they got 15 cyclists together. They got 15 cyclists and they put them through this FTP test to estimate their threshold. And then they also brought them back in and took them through a series of essentially like VO2 max tests, which for those of you who aren't familiar with VO2 max tests, usually those are done with like a ramp kind of protocol. So essentially you start out at a really easy exercise intensity and then you gradually increase the intensity every like 2 to 3 minutes until you get to failure, until you can't go any longer. And what the researchers did while they had them do these ramp tests, these VO2 max tests, was they also measured their levels of lactate in the blood. And so when lactate gets above a certain threshold in the blood, that's indicative of them going beyond their lactate threshold. So essentially that's how they measured their true lactate threshold in the blood, was by doing those tests in the lab. And then, like I said, they also had them go through that 20-minute FTP test to help to estimate their threshold. And what they did was they wanted to see, is that estimated threshold that they got from the 20-minute test, is it lining up with what they're truly measuring in their blood? And so whatever power outputs the cyclist got when they were doing that ramp test, whatever power output they were at when they crossed over their lactate threshold, does that true power number match up with the estimated power number that they got from the 20-minute FTP test? And so it was pretty cool what they found. They found that they found that the 20-minute FTP test lined up almost perfectly with the results that the cyclists got from measuring their lactate threshold in the lab by measuring it in their blood. And I'll go down here and I'll find a graph for you that might help depict this. But essentially, for example, if I go and I do the 20-minute FTP test and I find out that my estimated 60-minute threshold is 200 watts. Well, is my true 60-minute lactate threshold actually 200 watts? Or is it higher? Is it lower? What's the difference? So obviously there's going to be some error with all of these tests, no matter what. So there's error in every single test, even if it's small and even if it's as little as 1 or 2%, there's always going to be some error. So the goal isn't to necessarily perfect these tests, but it's to get pretty gosh darn close. And so that's what this study kind of showed, was that 20-minute FTP test gets you pretty close to what your true lactate threshold is for 60 minutes. And so if you look at this graph right here, graph A, the y-axis right here you see is MLSS. So this is maximal lactate steady state, which is essentially, for the purposes of this paper, they use this term to describe your 60-minute lactate threshold. So you're going to see power outputs over here of 60-minute lactate threshold measured in the lab. And then on the x-axis over here, you're going to see the estimated 60-minute lactate threshold that they got from the 20-minute FTP test. And so if we look at all these little black dots represent the 15 cyclists. And so this is a pretty good correlation actually right here. So this is basically showing one of the main findings of the study, which was that these tests match up pretty well. And so one good example of this is this little black dot right here. So this guy or girl, whoever it was, they came out to, when they measured it in the lab, they came out to a little bit over 225 watts, right? And now down here, when they did it with the 20-minute FTP test to estimate their threshold, they got, again, a little bit over 225 watts. So pretty close. And that's a pretty common theme amongst all these cyclists, is if you follow along to where they measured in terms of in the lab and then on the bike, they're all pretty close. There's some error because, like I said, no test is perfect. But this study found that basically this 20-minute FTP test that estimates your lactate threshold is a pretty valid test of determining your true lactate threshold. And so they did find that the FTP test tended to overestimate threshold just a little bit on average, which is pretty typical of this test anyways. So there's that. But again, this test was found to be a pretty decent test for determining your true lactate threshold. Now, one of the caveats of this, I mentioned earlier that this warm-up was important. And so this warm-up is essentially, you want to think of this entire 60-minute test as the test. Even though you're only using your 20-minute average power data from the 20-minute time trial, this warm-up matters, right? And so the researchers kind of talked about in their discussion afterwards that this warm-up is essential to prime the body for doing this 20-minute test, and that when researchers have studied this test and validated this test, it's been with this warm-up protocol exactly as it was written back when they developed it. Now, some people might go and they might do a really short warm-up and then jump right into the 20-minute time trial. And so the researchers talked about that when that's done, this 20-minute test might be more representative of 90% of your 60-minute threshold as opposed to the 95% of your threshold that you would get if you had gone through the whole warm-up. And so basically what that means is that this warm-up is important if you want to get a truly valid and accurate measurement of what your threshold is. And so to get the most valid measurement, do the warm-up. And so what the warm-up looks like would be this 10-minute easy spin with these 3 little 1-minute bursts with a 1-minute recovery in between, another 5-minute easy spin, and then this 5-minute time trial, which is essentially a 5-minute time trial at the same effort level that you're going to do this 20-minute time trial at. So this is like a little opener or warm-up for the legs. And then you get a nice 10-minute easy recovery, and then you hop into the 20-minute test before you do a short cool down at the end. And then obviously in the end, this 20-minute average power is what really matters in terms of estimating your threshold. But the test in its entirety is what matters if you want the most valid representation of your 60-minute threshold. And so that will bring me now into my final point that I do want to make is that that if you're used to doing a different test and you're not necessarily concerned with getting a 100% valid representation of what your threshold is, that's totally fine. So there are a variety of different tests out there that help estimate your threshold. And if you're someone who's always done a different test, that's totally fine. What matters is that you're doing that test under the same conditions, or at least as close as possible, and under the same circumstances every single time you do it. So that brings me to the reliability of these tests, right? So some of these tests haven't been studied and they don't necessarily have research to back up the validity of them. And that's okay, because at the end of the day, what you really want is, yes, you want to have a valid test. So if you're looking for a valid test, this test might be one of the ways to go, because this has a little bit of research to back it up and show that it's a true measurement of threshold. But if you're someone who's really partial to a different test, even if there's not necessarily any studies to validate it per se, what matters is that you're doing that test and all of these tests under the same circumstances every single time you do them. So for cycling tests, for example, these are pretty easy to do now indoors. So indoors is honestly one of the better options because you can control the environment. You can do it in the same conditions, on the same trainer, under the same circumstances every single time. You'd want to try and do them at roughly maybe the same time of day. You'd want to maybe make sure that you eat the same thing before you do the test as you did last time you did it, just because little things like that can affect how you feel and then can therefore affect the outcome of the test. And so by trying to control your environment and your circumstances as much as possible, it's going to lead to a more reliable test. So whether it's this test or a different test, what matters is that you're doing it under the same conditions and circumstances every time. For those of you who do these tests outside, that's fine as well. But what you want to make sure that you're doing is you're finding, one, a flat, open, uninterrupted section of road where you're not going to be hitting stoplights, you're not going to be slowed down, you're not going to have to stop and wait for traffic or for people crossing crosswalks, you're not going to be climbing major hills and going down descents, you're not going to be taking tons of corners and turns, because that's going to drop your power output, and you're not going to get as high of a 20-minute average power output as you would if you did it on a flat, uninterrupted, open stretch of road. So if you are someone who doesn't have a trainer and you do this outside on the road, just make sure that you're finding a piece of road where you have minimal turns, minimal climbs, and you have no stoplights. And then make sure that you do it on that same section of road every time you do the test. And that goes across all these tests, right? No matter what test you're doing. So controlling the environment and your circumstances is important. So hopefully this was somewhat helpful for you as a coach or as an athlete, and hopefully it helps inform your decisions as to what type of testing you do and how you do your testing to determine your threshold, because testing is a fairly important nowadays. It's a fairly important piece of training nowadays, because it helps inform our training zones, which then informs our individual training sessions, and then it's also used as a measure of fitness over time. And so again, this is just one test that people use to determine threshold for cycling. There are obviously a variety of tests that people do to determine other measures and markers of fitness. But I just thought that study that I had come across was pretty useful and insightful for others. And I enjoy reading through published research literature and then sharing some of my findings with others so that it can inform their training and racing and coaching just like it informs mine. So if you have any questions on any of this stuff, more than happy to answer them. Feel free to send me an email at peakenduranceSolutions@outlook.com. You can also go to my website at www.peakenduranceSolutions.com, and you can send me a message to my website as well. That'll get routed directly to my email inbox. So yeah, so send me any questions you might have, and also if you just have any comments on it, kind of curious to get some feedback on it as well. Let me know if you have any questions. Other than that, hopefully you found this useful and informative.